And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is Thomas Kunjapu here hosting this event about the role of managerial excellence in employee engagement. So we're really excited to talk through this topic today as part of the Cleary community. And we have a wonderful panel here with varied experience, which on this pretty arguably broad topic with lots of different nuances, but it's something I think we can all agree on is very important at this moment. So just a quick lay of the land as we get started. So first of all, I wanted to introduce myself and Cleary. So I'm the founder and CEO of Cleary. My name is Thomas Kunjapu. We are the digital employee experience platform behind some of the world's best places to work. And we love partnering with leadership teams in general, but specifically people and comms and IT teams as they're thinking about ways that they can really build the great workplaces of tomorrow. So we have a multifaceted approach around this. And we are, of course, working on this Cleary community, which we are glad you are here and as a part of, where we are really looking to build a community of like-minded individuals who are thinking about the future of work. And as the industry is just rapidly changing with so many different trends associated with how we just organize in the workplace. And so we thought there is a need for a community that's really trying to think ahead of how a great workplace of the future would come together. So we'd be doing virtual events like this. We'll be doing in-person events as well, doing trend analysis and industry news roundups. There's a weekly newsletter. We'd love for everyone to get involved because it's actually, it's going to take a whole community to figure out where this is all headed as we finally come out of this pandemic and settle down into defining, at least together, what the new normal is. So I would love to welcome you all into the Clear community and to be a part of that journey. And then one other thing I wanted to call out for those of you who happen to be in New York, we have a meetup we're doing in November 9th. So I think Steven's going to just drop a link in the chat to the event. In case you're in New York, come on by, meet some folks in person. We're gonna have some cocktails. And actually, if you're looking to do a new LinkedIn photo, this is the perfect time for you to do that because we've got this great venue. So anybody in New York, come on by and would love to meet you guys in early November. And one other thing before we get into into this particular panel is I want to just talk about the lay of the land with the live stream for those of you who haven't been here before. This particular tool, there is a chat. So go ahead and say hello or where you're calling in from if you want to just engage with us. And there's also a way for you to ask questions as we go along. We really want to make sure that we're addressing questions. And really a goal we have for any of our events is to make it as practical and useful as possible. And one of the easiest ways to do that is answering questions directly with right as it comes up. So with all that said, I wanted to set up a little bit before we introduce our panel, what we're here to talk about. So it's pretty interesting. So, there's been this study. It's actually originally done in 2015. I think it's been reproduced a couple different times. But when you think about employee engagement, there's this one study from Gartner that shows that a very, very high percentage of the variance you see in employee engagement comes directly from managers, right? So I think folks have probably heard the adage, you leave managers, you don't leave companies, right? When folks are leaving companies, but even in terms of your experience day-to-day and the engagement level, it can really be explained by that. Up to 70% of the variance in an engagement score and how engaged an employee is at a company can be explained by their direct manager, right? And yet, in this day and age, it's really challenging to be a manager. And so that's what we really want to talk about, right? So managers are overwhelmed. I think HR leaders across the board are seeing that they're getting that feedback constantly, right? So 76% say that there's just managers are feeling overwhelmed and something like an employee experience program is very challenging to implement within the context of everything else that managers need to do. And then there's a lack of change in leadership. So there needs to be, anytime you're making big changes in an organization, how that actually gets adopted and to be successful or have any shot at success, it needs to happen through managers. So everyone sort of agrees about that. But then are they well equipped? Maybe not. And then insufficient training. So specifically around hybrid leadership. So now they're moving into more of these hybrid and remote environments. There's these new challenges that managers are coming into, and are they receiving much formal training about this? Maybe not. It's definitely hindering the impact that managers can make. And then last couple items. So middle managers, now if we become really practical in 2023, a lot of middle managers across a lot of companies have been on the chopping block, and they're very highly vulnerable employee population in terms of layoffs or when there's like a downturn in the macroeconomic environment or for a particular company. And so if you empathize with the manager situation, from the HR perspective, it's actually it's like you're trying to do all this stuff, you're overwhelmed, and on top of that, it seems that you and your peers are the ones that are losing roles at a greater higher pace than others. And that also leads to a little bit of disengagement if you put it all together, right? This concept of, or this feeling of being disengaged and like burnt out or feeling unsupported. So wanted to share some of that rich context around what is going on, what we're seeing, the trends in the broader environment, right? But with that said, I'm really excited to introduce our panel here. And I would love for each of you all to introduce yourselves and say a few words about your current work and what kind of experiences you are bringing to bear to this conversation. I would love to start with you, Iris. You're on mute, so go ahead.
Yeah. It's always the first one to be called on is the one who's still on mute. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Iris McQuillan Grace. I am the global head of employee experience at Oliver. We are an advertising agency. We're about 5,000 employees over 46 countries. Prior to Oliver, I worked in professional services and spent 3 years at the Center for Reproductive Rights, all in a talent function. So I'm excited to talk about all the things that you mentioned, and maybe hopefully, field some questions from in the moment from who's watching, but hopefully share out, some strategies, some suggestions, some ways I failed so that you can fail better, fail forward from the things that I've, smashed my face against. And to also learn both from Lisa and Levy. Yeah.
Well, welcome. Lisa.
Yes. Happy to go next. I'm Lisa Shulkin. I'm the VP of People at TeamPay. We're a Series B fintech company based in New York. Prior to TeamPay, I've mostly led the people function for the past 7 years at other Series B and Series C SaaS companies. And similar to Iris, I also, in my past life, worked in HR and TA at professional services companies. So I have an interesting blend of both large and small company experience. I think the most interesting thing I've witnessed in the past 5 years is obviously the evolution to hybrid and remote work and making sure our employees and leadership all feel supported. I think there's no magical recipe, but I know there's a lot of thought leadership, including everyone on this call, and looking forward to hopefully being able to give teams ideas in terms of how we've handled things at some of my prior companies.
And we are past the technical issues, so
Levy. We're here. Amazing. So firstly, nowhere near as experienced as these two very, very, very cool titles. I'm an org dev comms manager, so I do internal comms. The other half of my role is that I get to also help on the org dev side. So not on the TA side, not like on bringing in talent, but talent lifecycle. So making sure that our talent kind of grows and watching the ebbs and flows of how their growth cycles go, upskilling and creating engagement across a 2,000-ish person company. Oh, and that company is B&H Photo. For those of you who love us, we're in New York City, and we have a huge following, and thank you for keeping me employed.
I was going to ask because, yeah, I love B&H Photo. I'm ex-New Yorker, but been out in the Bay for a while, but I always love checking it out. It's a really cool store. If anyone's even like visiting New York, it's actually even worth the visit, the flagship store. And so it's great to have some diversity and experience by industry even, and like the kinds of like workers, so even like the roles day to day of what it means to be a manager could be a little bit unique. So I'd love to start off by just talking about the power of managerial recognition. So I'm wondering if there's been any programs or ideas or ways that folks have, before we even get to how you can leverage managers to engage the employee base at large, what ideas or anything, or if at all, have you come across to actually engage with and recognize and engage managers direct themselves?
I have one it's not per se specific to managers, but I think it's gone over really well with our employee base and includes managers. We every week have a company-wide all hands, and we allow anyone in the company to nominate anyone else for a Values Hero award that corresponds with one of our 5 company values. I think it's a really lightweight way to recognize employees who are aligned with values, and also kind of reinforcing those values across the company and reminding everyone, what's important on a daily basis. So again, not specific to managers, but I think can certainly include them as part of the program.
I want to make sure I understood the question correctly. So the question, Thomas, is ways in which we've seen to recognize managers themselves, or ways in which we're encouraging. Okay, so I mean, I would say this is sort of universal. I think in the leveraging recognition throughout your one-on-ones, right? So that it's sort of, modeling that behavior from the top down. When you're meeting with your direct reports, who may or may not be managers themselves, you're modeling how to, honor recognition, integrate it with feedback, so that recognition really sort of becomes just a daily practice in an ideal world. And then taking that extra step and saying, and taking that assessment piece and saying, how do you want to be recognized? Some people love an all hands shout out. Some people get really embarrassed. Sometimes people really want mentorship or guidance. Some people are like, can you send me that class? Some people are like, oh, I really love it when you give me, we think about the love languages that we offer people in our lives, right? What are the recognition languages that we can be offering our employees, and making sure that we're modeling how to be thoughtful to how that person receives recognition and is seeking recognition. I think those are ways that we can be modeling, as I said, top down. So that's sort of a twofer answer, right? Because I think that's a way that we can honor and recognize managers, but also encourage them to be recognizing their individual contributors as well.
Got it. And actually, I'm curious, from a comms perspective, if you have any ideas specifically, are there programs that you've undertaken on the comms side of that about engaging managers directly, or has it also been this kind of global program?
So funnily enough, I'm actually directly involved with kind of manager leadership development. And so there's kind of a couple of approaches over here. I love what Iris was saying about like kind of understanding how people want to get recognized. And if you bake it into kind of if it's your one-on-ones or your quarterlies, whatever it is, it makes it a little bit more meaningful because you have that cadence. So you can do it either at a time of like, personal recognition, or you can do it at the larger scale. At our company, we're usually very considerate, and we'll try to mention like everyone on a team that participated. So like if we're doing an article about something, there's times that, our credit list will look like the end of a movie, where it's just like, it's too long. And I think it kind of, to that end, I wouldn't encourage people to go to, because I think it almost takes away from the recognition of the people who really did the lifting. And then on on the manager side, one of the things that we've done over here is we've created like these cohorts of managers to kind of work together, learn from one another. And it's very interesting to hear how across the company, there's a lot of different approaches to how they recognize people, whether it's on their team or even team leads or supervisors or their direct reports. And I want to encourage anyone who's listening to recognize that managers are employees also, right? So like anything that we're doing, like a manager is also part of that hierarchical chain, or if you're in a matrix organization, doesn't matter. They're still employed by the organization. And so however we're thinking about for employees, we also have to be thinking similarly for managers, because we spend all day recognizing employees and we never recognize good management, then we're not modeling that kind of, pay it forward type of thing.
I would also encourage those listening, especially those at founder-led companies. Founders are often treated like God in some ways. And I think any employee, managers especially, really appreciate direct recognition from founders for, substantial accomplishments. I've worked with founders at prior organizations to send personalized notes and gifts to individuals that have made significant contributions. And honestly, I think like a personal note from a founder often means more to employees than any monetary gift. Again, it depends on sort of, as Iris coined it, your love language and what matters most. But I think just the words thank you are often underestimated in our super busy and chaotic world.
And I think you raise a good point, because we'll spend so much time, energy, and resource in the attraction phase of the employee life cycle, right? And if we think about, I have a friend who's a tech recruiter, and she calls them, love bomb, which is, I don't know, but the thinking behind it is, right, we'll find out what they want and we'll give it to them. And sometimes that's FaceTime with the founder. Sometimes that's FaceTime with the CEO. Sometimes that's, I don't know, drinks, a trip, right? I'm thinking pre-COVID, right? When we would be able to really sort of roll the red carpet out, that white glove experience to get someone to enter the organization. And if we already know, and we've indexed that employee, and then we brought them, into the organization, right? How are we continuing to, offer those same opportunities, right? They're telling us what they want. That's why they walked through the door. And I feel that, most organizations tend to sort of, forget, right? We have very short memories once we've brought folks in, because the work is, okay, now it's the performance, and now we know, and now you're in the seat, we need to perform. And, if you've got it down, you've got a TA team who's doing all that work, you've got something to reference, right? You don't have to start again, right? So just something to think about, that I think that, calling almost our HR selves out to say, hey, if we've done all that work to get them, how are we continuing that relationship and that dialogue? Because I think you're right, Lisa. I think an email from a founder, I think a 5-minute, hey, this person's going to do the one-on-one for you instead of me. Do you want to pitch them a new idea? What about this new app feature? What about this new product or whatever? I think that's such a strong retention strategy. When we think about people leaving, 9 times out of 10, it's never money. It is always the recognition piece. It's always, or it's a piece that's, the money is ancillary to the real reason why they're walking out the door.
I want to jump in on that, if I may. So I love that love bomb analogy, because it's almost like you go like all like it's like the wooing side. So like you do everything that you can to attract the person, and then you forget that that's just to get the relationship started.
Right.
And the real work comes after you're in the relationship, right? Like I'm married, so like take it, from someone who knows from experience, right? Like step 1 is getting to the marriage side, but then step 2 is then you have the whole life cycle, the rest of it. And that's something which has been, I kind of referenced it earlier. Like that's something that's been fascinating to me, is like, once we get the correct talent through the door, thanks to the TA team and all that process, if your, first week or two is just like, whoa, just throwing stuff onto them, and then like the rest of your life cycle doesn't match, at least on the value side or kind of the rest of it, like you're kind of sending very different messages. And I think that people are, especially, I'm getting probably a little bit ahead of the conversation over here, but in the 3 to 10 year range that can really take a heavy dip, because it's no longer matching their initial experience.
That's a great point. I mean, I think this is, it kind of maps honestly also to how a lot of companies treat their consumers. New customer, 80% off, come on in for the year 1. Year 10 customer, it's like you're paying 10x the price. Some companies do it that way. But certainly that the concept of the customer experience maps into the employee experience. We think about that a lot. And yes, it tends to be the most structured part of that is actually before anything. It's the talent acquisition process where there's every step matters. You think about every angle from the new hire, the candidate's point of view. We actually have a white paper out about the onboarding experience, which is what we're recommending as like the place to start, if nothing else. We see this constant underinvestment, and it's usually only after significant churn that a lot of companies start investing in the actual ongoing employee experience often. And starting with just the onboarding period, which is not just like 2 weeks of information dump, but they think more broadly to a 90-day and 6-month plan can really help there. And yet, coming back to managers and how they come into this, right? And yet, it often is what the manager does, including in the onboarding period, or when someone is a part of that, like, is becoming more productive and part of the company over like the first couple of years, we can really influence in really ensuring there is a great experience there, right? So what are the things that on the the people team, on the leadership side, that we can do to really enable managers to develop their employees so that they are getting engaged into becoming an engaged and productive member of the workforce? What kind of programs have you seen to enable managers, and where you see the difference, right? So going back to that quote, people leave managers. What are the activities that you've seen that most impact people wanting to stay with managers?
I think it's really critical, especially in the tech world, to have training opportunities for first-time managers. Oftentimes you see in the startup world individuals who are really strong ICs move into managerial roles, but often don't have the toolkit given to them. And there's companies like Life Labs Learning and others that I think provide really strong foundational tools. If you don't have a large HR team or in-house L&D group, you can often outsource training and work with the vendor to help customize training for your employee needs. I think it's also just important to recognize that there's different levels within management. I've often leaned on some of our more experienced managers and partnered them with a less experienced manager to offer advice. I've done this in a formal capacity if we've had formal mentorship programs in place, but I've also done it more informally if I realize there's a newer manager who might be struggling and could really benefit from learning from someone else cross-functionally who has a more experience under their belt. So I think understanding the level that someone is coming in at and what their needs are, and then customizing, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think a readiness piece is also a way maybe to tie recognition and managerial readiness. I think when you're at scale, and that could mean what, I would say anything above like 2,000 employees would be my guess, right? Where you've got enough, middle management, but then you've got a bench ready. That bench is maybe an opportunity to provide some cohort learning, right? So you've got some high potential performers already identified. Maybe a way to recognize them, right, if they've raised their hand and they're interested in that next step, is to sort of, tap in a vendor or your L&D team and create some cohort learning. So you're building some community, but you're also building some consistency, some shared language, expectations around what management looks like, so that when that strong IC is tapped for promotion, they're in a better position to handle that first time management piece. I've only worked in one place where you've had that capability. More often than not, it's as Lisa said, right? We grew, we hired people, they were great at their jobs, go, train them to be managers, let's hope people don't leave. And that's where I think that manager boot camp, right, which I've run at 2 prior organizations, similar to what Lisa was outlining, has been very successful. I would just sort of tag in that cohort piece because it provides a safe space. Everybody's learning together. Everybody can fail. Making what I call that first bad pancake in a laboratory setting with an external vendor or an internal facilitator, and then continuing that discussion, right? Quarterly check-ins. How is it going? How is this going? Right. So you're providing that either that mentorship or even that opportunity, right? So maybe it's a manager roundtable that you run, right? Just to make sure that the ROI of whatever you were spending for that vendor, right? That those behaviors at that level are being really adopted and then funneled downward.
I think there are also just some, because I've been in highly resource constrained organizations for the past 7 years that we haven't always been able to even hire an outside vendor. One of the things I've employed previously is a book club and selecting a topic that's relevant to managers and ensuring there's a facilitator and then having really great dialogue across a cross section of managers. And it often brings up, issues they're facing on their own teams and asking others for how they've solved for those challenges. So I think my advice too, and I get caught up in it also, is I don't have the funds to do this program. Like, how am I going to, give managers enough resources? And I think there are a lot of things you can do that are low cost and still facilitate that dialogue and cohort learning like Iris talked about.
I am just going to say everything that these ladies just said, but the one thing I would add is don't get too into your head about it. You can start and then iterate. So it's more important to kind of get the process going, and you will probably learn from the people who are in your cohort or your first batch, kind of what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and then kind of use that to then make the program better. So that's like, if it's just a book club, do a book club, right? Start there, but get the process started, because no one's waiting for you to catch up.
Yeah, I think the moment you have, we talk about at scale, what scale looks like, 2,000 employees, maybe you have about 200 managers and you've got cohorts and you can really do that. But I'm of the belief that once you have 2 managers at the company, that's enough for a book club, or the amount of leverage that you can have to actually get just talking about how to do this. There's so much leverage, right? Which is the whole topic here. So if nothing else, there's a lot of free resources out there or books, and you can just get together and have some conversation, which in my experience naturally leads to, and this is how this relates to this current situation, like for me or like with my direct report, and that you get to at least build some minimum level of capacity internally, which is great because now you've got something kind of self-service, right? Maybe a motion of a feedback loop of learning without too much intervention on the HR side, right? So I think I kind of went to an extreme with just 2 managers, but clearly a little bit above that, it's definitely there's value. So then are there any other ideas for cost constraint folks who are really looking to leverage and improve management capacity?
I think
can you restate the question? Sorry.
Yeah, other ideas to enhance manager capacity on a tight budget.
So one of the things we did 2 companies ago where I worked, we were a hospitality tech company going through the COVID era. So we were particularly constrained. In that time, we decided to launch monthly manager meetings that I facilitated and purposely excluded our founding team so that we created a safe space for managers to be able to share feedback. Topics changed. Sometimes it was more of a free-flowing vent session because that's what managers needed at that moment. Other times I would share HBR articles around a specific topic, and we'd discuss, how their teams were handling that specific topic. And it was a nice way for people to exchange information. But I think it's really important to create that safe psychological space, especially, again, I come from founder-led companies where founders have often been very dominant in inserting their opinions and their approach forward. And some employees and managers are afraid to speak up. So I often took feedback from those manager sessions and bubbled it up to our executive team to share areas where I thought we might be able to improve within the company, as well as on the flip side, these are the things that our managers think we're doing really well and we should continue. And that obviously totally free, just requires some planning. And I think also I tapped into managers at my company who have even more managerial experience than I do and would ask them, what topics do you want to address? Like, what's most relevant to you right now? So I think that's the listening is really important from a people ops standpoint, and then being able to deliver on what the team is craving versus what I think they might want.
I mean, another thing to try, so you're getting everyone is sort of like a sentiment survey, right? Like a pulse survey once a quarter. And that can be a really easy lift. That's a Google form, right? You don't have to do Pecan. You don't have to, right? And then this way, you don't get the segment analysis that you would, but you're able to pull out and say, yeah, okay, so, you get some comfortability or anonymity from the people who are submitting, so they get that sort of safe space. And then you're also tapping into your ICs, because I've also worked at places that have been bootstrapped where we've had that new fleet of new line managers, and they think they are crushing it, and their ICs are like, you are crushing me, right? And so that disconnect, it can't distinguish itself if I'm only interfacing here, right? So I get that direct feed loop. So sort of to your point, Lisa, of like removing the founders, right? Really getting that full cycle in, because then you're able to sort of do a more targeted and like approach, right? Is it this? Do we actually need to train our ICs about upward feedback, right? Is that actually what's missing? We're spending all this time getting our managers to be great at being managers, but we're not empowering our ICs to be advocates for themselves, to not give feedback upwards, to not ask for feedback, to not take feedback well, right? So that feedback loop has to go both ways. Or we over-indexing on one employee population and forgetting the others?
That's a great point about enabling employees to give feedback and being confident that it is going to be taken in the right way, especially when it's like to your boss or about the company. So we have, this is inspired from my time at Twitter, but we have a Q&A events product within our product suite, which our customers use for all hands meetings. And you see kind of how company cultures kind of go in, and we're simple tool makers, but from the very extreme, you can have anonymous questions for every all hands meeting that anyone could ask that can go directly to 100% transparency and visibility, all the way to, hey, just a department-wide private session with names and clarity, which leads to like a different type of kind of context and how people like say the things. But there's also, I guess, in addition to giving feedback directly about a person, there's also feedback and thoughts about a department, a process, a product strategy. Just the willingness to speak up in general can actually like help move the conversation forward at a company. Great points here. So one point I'd like to go a little bit deeper on, and is something we've all kind of gone through to different degrees, is the concept of hybrid work, and how does the role of a manager shift when you have remote employees or a hybrid policy, and the new nuances that like folks are facing. So I'm curious if folks here have war stories or things you've tried, things that haven't worked, or things that you've heard about. We can put it under the cover that way, that are all around how the role of being a manager has shifted in the era of remote and hybrid work.
My point of view is I think you have to be even more intentional in your communications and how you set meeting cadences. Whereas, when we all used to be in an office, it was easy to have that water cooler chat or sit down at lunch across from someone. And I think, managers now just have to be, or should be, more structured in their approach to ensure that they're able to have both one-on-one conversations with employees, as well as bringing the team together in a constructive way. I'm personally very much a fan of still bringing teams together in person if there is budget, at least once a quarter. I think it still is important in terms of rapport building, getting outside the workplace, et cetera. But in lieu of that, I think there's also platforms, especially now, that help facilitate cross-team activities in this hybrid world. I've worked specifically with a platform called Wavy that facilitates different employee experiences and activities and enables managers to go in and plan their own events for their team. So that kind of takes the onus off the HR team specifically. And then I think it's also asking your team as a manager, like, what would you like to see? How do you prefer to communicate, and tailoring your approach based on, their responses as well.
I'm going to hop in over here because I don't think that my company is officially hybrid. At this point, we're 4 days back in the office. Anyone who's necessary is for sure there on Friday, and then like a lot of us get to be, work from home on Friday. But observations, because during COVID, we also obviously went fully remote like everyone else did, aside for warehouse and, the superstore as soon as we were able to reopen it. And I think the lessons that we had, also if anyone here follows my LinkedIn, you know that I'm a pretty big fan of being back in the office. But lessons that I think that we can take is that you have to be extra intentional. So really just echoing what Lisa was saying, like you have to be extra intentional at creating the bonds and at creating the kind of camaraderie. But I would lead that with, if you're a remote company, you may want to go the complete other direction. There's a lot of companies that have found success in being intentionally remote and so remote that they don't create those camaraderies, because that's the whole point of being remote, is you're kind of just on your own and filling it in. And so I think you really have to ask yourself as a company, what are we and where are we? If we want to be a garage and we want to be all together, then there's a ton of value in bringing the team together and creating those bonds. If you want to be fully remote, check in when you need to and check out when you don't want to, like that's great also. But you have to be really intentional and then let people know that that's what you're doing, right? And then cadence, I think, is really important also. So if it's a weekly check-in, a monthly check-in, a bi-weekly, whatever it is, like that cadence has to be there. And if you stay on top of it, then you go. And what's funny is everything I just said, I'm talking a little fast, but everything I just said is the same thing you need to do in an office, right? Like you got to do it either way. Like, and as a manager, if you're working remotely and the intentions are to bring your team together, then you have to be extra intentional about doing it, because you don't get that, like Lisa was saying, you don't get like the water cooler, the hallway conversation that people love or hate from the office space. But that's one of I think the distinct advantages to being in the office, that you're able to have that kind of just on the fly kind of conversation, where if you're remote, you have to be so much more intentional about it. It's doable, but it needs the intentionality.
But I think you also have to be thoughtful from that hybrid, right? I'm just lifting up that part from your first question, Thomas, right? If the expectation is a blend, right? From a D&I perspective, where are we being thoughtful, right? Are we ensuring that just because you're not in the office, because you physically aren't able to, that, you still have the opportunity for advancement, for mentorship, for coaching, that you still have the opportunity to forge those relationships, cross-functional or otherwise, that your opportunity to give and receive feedback and recognition is as considered and, as thoughtful and as prolific as it is if it happened organically, right? So just echoing the intentionality, but sort of layering that thinking around specifically in a hybrid environment, right? Because COVID changed the game. We all know that, right? But one of the opportunities that it gave us was to rethink, and, there's an opportunity in the disruption, right? So the state of play has changed, and the opportunity around that is, especially from a D&I perspective, is whose voices were being heard, not everyone is great at advocating for themselves, right? Those same people who don't want the shout out in the town hall might want the recognition, might be an incredible manager, might be ready to be that SME, but might not in a pre-COVID environment have been tapped from a succession planning or workforce planning perspective. And so when we think about recognition, empowering our managers, and working in a dynamic hybrid environment, just being aware of all the touch points that we can offer mirror or parallel experiences for.
And one thing I'd also add that I think is certainly one of the challenges of being hybrid or remote is cross-functional interaction. I think, again, that's easier to do when you're all in the office. Right. So most of the companies I've been at for the past 6 years have very intentionally thought about what type of activities to host. Maybe if, let's just say, the CS and sales teams are clashing, thinking about some kind of team building activity they can do either virtually or in person. And those activities have often helped eliminate the tension that has built up on the teams. And I think, that's where we as like HR practitioners and managers need to become more creative and innovative in terms of what is that balance for bringing different teams together that might not necessarily be in touch with one another on as regular a cadence.
And there's so much innovation that comes from those teams, right?
Yeah.
Whether you use sort of design sprints or how you sort of think through, right? Offering those opportunities, I think that's a really strong call out, because no matter where you work, you make something. And if you are only making with the same, you can't possibly make something different.
Right. I'm just going to hop in on this because I know that we're struggling with a couple of teams that should be working together, and they're kind of, even though they might be like on the same floor, they're kind of living in their own spaces. And one of the suggestions I gave to the team as a whole is like, give them interesting problems to solve together and force them to solve them, right? So like, to this idea of a design sprint, like take them for a day and say like, hey, this is something we've always wanted to tackle. We never had the bandwidth to do it. We're stopping everything for a day, and now we're going to do it. And we don't know the results yet, but I'm hoping that it's going to be really good, because I think like when you give people interesting problems to solve, right? Like I'm a big fan of being back in the office. I'm not a big fan of ping pong tables, because I don't think that those are what make your office, right? What makes your office is doing interesting work with interesting people who are, putting in the effort, right? When you slog together, then you build a camaraderie. And that also works remotely or hybrid as well. But like, that's the idea. That's what brings people together within companies. Not ping pong tables are kind of like an accoutrement or like the icing on the cake, because then you have a space to kind of like, blow off steam together. But that's not what actually builds the company together. And so I'm going to try to bring this back to managers. So how can managers do this in a hybrid environment? Is number one, extra intentionality, extra touch-ins. When you're in the office, leverage the office for what it's good for, right? Which is having people to come together, to work together in person, right? When they're going into like the remote space, I think understand the idea that when people are in a remote space, that is really good productivity time for them. And maybe reduce notifications during that time. You don't have to send out that good morning, good afternoon, good evening, right? Like maybe there's only 2 checkpoints during that day, or, it's simple like, hey, everyone, here's the thing that we're going to do. And then an end of day kind of catch up. You don't have to have every single minute their WhatsApp or their Teams or their Slack going bing, 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 because then all you're doing is introducing distractions into what should be really good focus and productivity space.
Yeah, I know a lot of teams at my current company and prior organizations have leveraged a daily stand-up, or like, let's say a Monday, Wednesday, Friday stand-up to meet as a team just for like 10 minutes at the start of the day and go over key priorities, any questions, et cetera. I think that can work really well. I think, again, the other challenge with hybrid and remote, especially if your company is global and across the US, is time zone changes. And so I think that's something I've had to be extra mindful about as a leader whenever we organize either in-person or virtual activities, is how do we ensure maximum participation and ensure that the entire population feels included and it's not infringing upon their time with their families, friends, et cetera, outside of working hours.
So that's so funny you say that, because we offered an asynchronous sort of Teams channel in lieu of that stand-up. And every Friday, someone on the team each week picked a genre of music. And then every week we would tag in like a music video, and it kicked off Friday morning, whenever your Friday morning was. And it's super light. It's not going to solve the key priorities. It's not going to handle, right? This is not the moment to solve the big, interesting problem. This isn't the moment to get through the whatever the tension is, right? But it was such a nice touchstone for the week that built some community on the back end, right? And then you got to know a little bit about somebody's personality, right? About someone, and it wasn't as big a time commitment as here's a book to read, here's this video to watch, here's this training to watch. It was, and it allowed people's personalities to show. Someone on the team was like, just Bridgerton songs. Bridgerton, you had to go and you had to see. It was really fun, which is like, sounds like it's superfluous and has no bearing in this very serious employee engagement conversation. But I think the other thing I wanted to interject is that part of recognition and team building is the fun part of going to work, especially now I'm inviting you into my home, right? When you work remotely, you see my whole life. My pump is right here. I have 2 children, right? So like part of that is knowing my whole life, whether I kind of want you to or not. And so bringing some fun in, bringing a part of your life in, right? Provided you feel psychologically safe, right? We've done all the work of, we understand how people like these things. We're giving feedback. We're doing these things. And output of that will be someone feels safe enough to be their real selves. And so that's where this icing on the cake is. Maybe, you know, you figure out what someone's cool dance move is. When I was at the center, my team did if anyone's familiar with Drag Race, RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah.
So we did a lip sync competition. I to this day feel like I should have won, and I did not. Someone brought props and I was gutted. They did let it go and they brought props and puppets and it was hilarious. And I was like, that's amazing, right? That's not going to work for every team. I don't bring those 2 examples because they should be, you know, the watershed moments for all fun. But as an opportunity to say, like, it is serious. This is serious. We are also, maybe it doesn't have to be so serious, you know?
Right. And especially managers who are in the middle of it all, right? Between like founders and execs and everything that need to deliver. They might not feel that levity
it's not
all
the
the
first
time.
thing you think of, right? And so it's just an opportunity to sort of think about, you know, those opportunities, right? Not everything has to feel so precious. This is an opportunity for me to know you so that I'm doing a good job as a manager. It's like,
I love these ideas. And it's like juxtaposing a couple of different concepts in my mind. So on the one hand, we're talking about how like this, you know, Friday primer where people are talking and showing their personalities. For example, if someone's into one show versus another, it may more naturally happen in a lunchroom or, you know, like people that might happen more naturally, but then having the intentionality of some kind of ritual like that when you're remote or hybrid helps ensure that it happens. On the other hand, with Levi's example, I mean, their team sitting on the same floor, going to work every day, and they hate each other. And like, they're not naturally talking to each other about, you know, their favorite shows, right? So there's some intentionality there too. It's just a little bit different. One doesn't, you know, solve necessarily completely in one direction or not. You need to have some level of it. But then I love that concept that Lisa brought in about both cross-functional teams and specifically time zones, because especially with cross-functional teams, it's more difficult to then hire in the same time zones. You might try to get individual teams to line up more, and that's when it gets even more difficult. So I think for me, one of the skill sets for managers especially is writing. Asynchronous communications and written communications becomes a more central part of the toolkit because you're just not going to be as live with as many people as much of the time. But great conversation all around. I'd love to go to a question here from Brandon from the group here. I love this question. So Brandon's working a lot of places where managers are evaluated almost exclusively on a specific set of team output metrics. So how can we build the employee engagement and development piece into how managers are being evaluated? And I'll just add to this, if managers are, from some of my stats before, right, they're feeling a little bit relatively burnt out, and they are maybe a little bit vulnerable in terms of like layoffs, and that all these things are also like in their minds, right? And then they kind of end up focusing on the output metric, right? What am I optimizing for? What am I being measured on? And so is engaging your team actually something that managers are being measured on?
If it isn't, it should be.
I think it's
like, why
really
isn't that one of
important.
your, right? Like, why isn't that, if you're working OKRs, why isn't that embedded into, right? Or objectives or SMART goals or whatever, right? Like, whatever your metrics are, I would anticipate a high performing team is one of them. And one of the key results of, right, like one of those sub goals or however you're measuring, right, should be a highly engaged and performing team. And you can set ROI, right? You can set those metrics to see if that's working. Engagement scores, performance reviews, feedback around you, right? Their own outputs. And so I would say if it's not, then it should be.
I'm just going to jump in here and be like, this is going to sound binary, but there's kind of two ways to get a high performing team. One is to whip the crap out of them until they perform. The other one is to get them highly engaged, right? Like Iris was saying, a highly engaged team will almost always outperform the whip team, right? And so by definition, if you are measuring output, you are measuring how highly engaged a team is, even if you're not directly measuring it. And then what a company, I don't know the particulars of this company, but what a company can do to then build it in, whether it's through, as Iris was saying, OKRs or SMART goals, is to either connect to values or leadership principles of some sort. And many, many, many companies already have ideas of what are the things that they want to promote. And so if their idea around productivity is also quick decision making, then great. Now we can also highlight quick decision making. If around it is a highly engaged team and we want to have high performance, then we'll take a look at those 180s or 360s to kind of see who are the people who are constantly getting that kind of really positive push forward. And then whether or not they're, super out there or super quiet, if they're constantly getting those recognitions, you start to know like, hey, these are my people, and these are the ones who are pushing productivity forward.
Yeah, I just want to add that, yeah, typically I like that like dichotomy. I mean, there's probably other nuances to that, but I love that like just sharp picture, Levi. And then, yeah, typically it's really about the time scale within which you're measuring engagement or like outcomes. So forget all the other metrics, just literally the team is supposed to perform. Engineers are supposed to ship code. CS teams are supposed to close tickets or do renewals or close deals or drive MQLs, depending what you're doing on a sufficient time scale, right? The right set of things that you're doing as a manager should get those specific metrics moving in the right direction as well. But it's really about having the organizational patience, right, to think in that way, where it's not just about like this quarter or the next quarter. To me, it goes back to the conversation Iris brought in about all the effort put into talent acquisition. It's like usually on a team and manager level, it's like, but performance is great, but all of a sudden, okay, we've had 2 high performers quit. And that's usually because of a lack of a good team dynamic that has emerged from, which is something that a manager can very much control. And so that's when you start having the conversation, well, let's rebuild this. We need to rebuild it better. But ideally, you don't need to go through that entire cycle, right, before you start seeing that. Great question. I appreciate everyone's thoughts on this. So then just to close out, I just really want to empathize with managers at this moment, right, where new skill sets that are needed because you're hybrid or remote. And on top of that, there's just higher turnover. So you're probably managing newer employees more than, a couple of years ago. And there's also just a lot of managerial disengagement, right? So they're feeling like burnt out. And I wonder if, overall, if you guys have some, especially from like an HR or people team perspective, like what can we do to really encourage our managers so that they can really be this like front line of engaging the entire employee base, right, in 2023?
I mean, one thing I would encourage managers to do is to go to your manager or your people ops team and share where you feel challenged or roadblocked and where you could use some assistance. I think, again, one of the challenges in this hybrid remote world, it's really hard to take the pulse of how everyone's feeling. For instance, at my company, we announced some major changes on Monday, and I'm, just slacking people individually to be like, how did that resonate with you, et cetera. And I think there are certain key employees I know will be more vocal, but I also want to hear from folks that I don't necessarily hear from all the time. So I think it's creating feedback loops to be able to empower your managers to have the resources or the tools that they need to be successful with their teams too.
Yeah, I think that creating that ritual, that space, that sort of structured and intentional environment for managers. So whether it's the cohort learning, right? You keep those manager roundtables and maybe 3 people show up, maybe nobody shows up, right? Maybe it's a mandatory once a quarter, right? But sort of having that in the back of your mind, knowing that that's an opportunity, right? But also, if you can, if it's possible, to begin those one-on-one relationships from a people team perspective, right? If you, and hopefully you're in an organization where if you're, a team of 1, right, you can sort of do that to whatever extent. If you're a team of 2, if you've got an HRBP you can be close to, if you've got a head of people you can be, right, or just even sort of make any kind of inroad or connection to, because right now that first line of management has to be such a well-versed utility player that only so much amount of training can fill in the gap, right? And nobody's going to be great at every single piece of it. And especially if you're going through layoffs or big change, or, it's just, you're understaffed. It doesn't matter what the challenges are necessarily, more so than the call out just to who do you have and who can you tag in when it gets overwhelming? Because you are, right? And I think, Lisa, you brought this up. Where are you in management, right? If we think about these 4 levels of management, are you managing ICs, managers of managers? Are you right? And all of those people need help. We are all people. We're all still human beings, and we need someone to talk to.
I also think on the employee experience front and onboarding piece, I think and maybe I'm super old school in thinking this, I think if you do have an ability to bring new hires to your office or whatever space you use for congregating in their first 6 months, I do think it makes a difference in their long-term trajectory at the company and feeling more connected. Again, my company has been mostly remote this year, so we haven't been able to do that, but I often hear feedback from employees. They do want more face-to-face connection time. And I think we can't lose sight of that either for both groups, ICs and managers.
I was going to go a different direction, but following on what Lisa was saying, there's a study, I don't have it on the tip of my head right now, and I apologize, that a lot of us assume that Gen Z wants to be remote. And there's a tremendous amount of push from Gen Z to meet other people in the workforce, to learn from them. And they very much lean more toward a hybrid approach, but they very much recognize the idea of we want to be around other people who've done this well so that we can learn from them. And I think that a lot of us lose sight of it because they also want, all the flexibility of a remote or hybrid style of work. But what Lisa's saying, bringing people into the office and creating those connections has so much compounding returns later on.
And ideally, you can do it on some cadence. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, or a cadence or around new hire. It might be a yearly summit. There's so many. At that point, there's so many ways to do it. But definitely, I think early on in their career, to definitely pair them up with someone as a learning buddy or someone as they're getting into whatever organization you are in is tremendously valuable. I wanted to give a huge shout out to managers because I think managers are, they have such a hard role right now, as Iris was saying. And because you're expected on the ops side to do things and you're expected to be people's therapist. And I'm saying that sarcastically, but it's actually that's the expectation. And I think managers are in a very, you're in a very crucial spot for your company because you are the first line of leveraging or the ground level of leveraging, or maybe the mid level of leveraging, whatever it is. And I think that there's a couple things that you can do for yourself. As much as you're trying to upskill your employees and help your employees, don't forget to help yourself. So find your mentors in your organization, find your sponsors, find your people who are going to help you grow and get better at what you're doing, whether that's on the HR side, whether that's, within the ops side or whatever other side of the company that you're in. If you're in a much smaller company, see if there's other early members of the company or people outside. Like, I mean, we're in the internet age. There's so many places to kind of get that, but I personally highly encourage getting that kind of one-on-one time with either a mentor or someone else who could kind of play your coach, and so you're not the only one doing coaching, you're also getting coached.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank the entire panel for this riveting discussion. We went in so many different directions off of this one key insight, which is managers can be a point of incredible leverage in 2023 and beyond.